essentially, we work with small growers around the UK and Europe. Everything is hand harvested. So we pack it into small baskets or slightly larger baskets, and it's delivered here to London. So what we do straight away is as soon as we get the fruit, we double check it to make sure it's the quality we need in terms of sugars and acidity, and that it's disease free. We then take those grapes, and depending on the wine style, we do different things. So if it's for a sparkling, we'd generally put it all in the press and whole bunch press it. If it's for a white, we would de-stem it and treat the grapes differently. If it was for a red, we would take the berries off the stalks and leave it to ferment in contact with the skin. So the style of wine will dictate what we do with the fruit. As a winery, our philosophy is take really good fruit, but make something different with it. You know, don't copycat styles done by others, if we can help it. So we make pet nat sparklings, traditional method sparklings, whites, orange wines, rosé wines, and red wines. So we do the whole gamut.
When you say orange wine, is it the amber wine?
Essentially, I think when anyone talks about orange wine, they're talking about the level of skin contact that a white grape has had with its juice. And so red wines have full skin contact because they become red with the red skins. And white wines, if in contact with the whiter skins, they will become different colors depending on how long they've had in contact with the skin. You know, if it's been 3 hours, it might be quite light amber or orange. If it's had 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 months or 6 months, it'll become much darker and orangey. So we do both of those styles.
Okay. Today, I want us to just concentrate on a little bit more in the processing of wine on red wine.
Sure.
Do you use yeast or do you use the natural yeast?
It depends. It depends. We used to do almost entirely wild ferment, so using only airbound or skin-bound yeast. It changed a bit when we built this place, because in 2021 we moved here from Bethnal Green and we had to sanitize the place. We had to paint it and make it completely fresh. And the problem with that is that you wipe away all bacteria and yeast strains. So for the first year or two, we had to add yeast to our wines to make them start, or to have a clean fermentation. But what we actually love to do is if we get a bunch of grapes, or 2 tons or 3 tons of grapes, we will separate it into different parcels. And we will say, do 1 portion as a wild fermentation, then you get an interesting, different direction of the wine that you can't really control, but it can bring really interesting styles. And then if you have another or 2 other parts where you've added yeast, you then get that more controllable directional flavor if you want a cleaner, more aromatic style. So what we like to do is to do it both together. Do it wild and do inoculated, and then blend them together. Then you get kind of the best of both worlds.
So you blend these together?
Yeah. So you ferment them separately. So you'd have a wild ferment and an inoculated ferment. And then at the end, depending on how that blend would work, you can decide how more towards the natural side you want to go and how more towards the cleaner style you want to go. And we find that actually combining different approaches can lead to a better outcome.
Is it kind of difficult because if you know what sort of wine you want to produce at the end, does it make your world a little bit difficult to manage what exactly you want? If you want a fruity style, does it make any difference when you just use natural and white yeast?
I think so. If you're a winery looking to produce wines that are very consistent in style, then it's hard to do that if you're using only wild yeasts. So that's why the big boys will always inoculate, because they need consistency. They need sugars, acids, winemaking to be consistent. It has to be a recipe. Our philosophy is let the vintage dictate what we make. So if it's low acid, high sugar, or high sugar, low acid, or if there's parts of the vintage that mean the wine would naturally go in a different direction, we normally let it do that. But what that means is our customer base has to be open-minded that 2022 Chardonnay is not going to be the same as 2023. Or, they have to be, and in the kind of larger scale of the wine space, people want consistency. It's only at the more artisanal level they can cope with differences.
Do you have ever any problem with mold when you just during the fermentation, especially when you use white yeast? Just a little mold on your wine, and then how to deal with it?
No, not really. No, we've never had mold issues. I mean, often if you do barrel fermentation, you can get a developing of floor, FLOR, on the top. which
little.
there's like little like streaks of white, you know.
Yes.
We get that sometimes, and that often protects the wine from oxidation. But it depends on winemaking style, whether you go down that route or whether you intervene more to prevent those things.
I'm asking this question only because I'm getting so many questions about those who make wine at home.
Yeah.
And then they have problems with mold. And I was wondering if you have any kind of suggestions to them?
I think the most important thing is if during the fermentation needs to be happy and healthy. So the yeast strains have to be happy so that the fermentation continues well. And I think maybe the use of nutrients to make sure that the yeast is getting the food and things that it needs is a good idea. I mean, I'm not sure out there in the public market what products are available, but yeah, temperature control is important. Making sure everything is really clean. People often talk about winemaking being essentially cleaning. You know, sterilizing everything, making sure that every part of the process that's touched by grapes or grape juice is completely sterilized. And then just making sure that temperature is looked after as well. So we've just finished the 2024 harvest. So in all of these tanks, we've got different wines made with grapes from all over the UK, Herefordshire, Hampshire, Essex, Suffolk. And we've got a couple made with European grapes. But this one is an English Pinot Noir that we bought the grapes from Essex near Colchester, and our plan is to make it into a still English white Pinot Noir. So,
is it a new thing?
People have made white Pinot Noirs, but it's not super common. It's not very common. But the philosophy of the winery is to try and take fruit and make it into something different. So again, if you see here, whoops, woo!
Wow, it's very pinkish.
It's still very pinkish, but color drops out through fermentation and aging. Yeah. So a lot of that pinkiness will actually come out.
Which stage is this?
This, let me just tell you. So it's finished, basically. The wine is finished fermenting. So.
How long has it been there? How long?
When did we take that fruit from the Pinot Noir? End of October. So what are we now? End of November. So yeah, it'll have finished fermenting by now. So juice, whole bunch press, into tank, settle, rack it off to a new tank, fermentation at a low temperature, chilled temperature, and so it's just finished fermenting. It's finished fermentation. But again, it's super young. Like this, you will not be selling it at this stage. You know, it's still quite raw.
For how long do you keep it in the bottle?
We will age it in tank because you might want to give it some lees contact.
Stands still, or?
We'd move it around a bit, depending on how much lees contact we want, and then we would bottle it, and we would leave it to age in the bottle at least 3 or 4 months before selling it. Yeah, wines go through what they call bottle shock when it goes through the bottling line.
Very nice.
Yeah, high acidity.
That's going to be lovely if that's only a month old.
Yeah, it's a month old, but again, one of the things you get from English grapes, high acidity. You know, you get that kind of like, woo, you know, which goes well with a lot of foods. Some English producers take away that acidity. You can do deacidification, but we generally leave it in because it's just something that is English, you know, that is uniquely English. So all the grapes are sorted and then put in the press. The press squeezes them, the juice comes clear, you transfer it to a tank, let it settle overnight at cold temperatures so that all the solids drop to the bottom. And then you do what's called racking it. So you're taking the juice off of any solids and transferring it to tank, a clean tank. This wine, we add a yeast strain. So we add nutrients, we add a yeast strain that's been hydrated and chosen for this specific variety. And then we set the temperature. All of these tanks are temperature controlled. So during fermentation, obviously the yeast eats the sugar and it creates carbon dioxide, booze, alcohol, and heat. And so if you want to keep wines of a certain style, you have to make sure the temperature is kept low enough. So we have to cool these tanks down. And then
When you say low, how low?
between 12 and 15 degrees Celsius. Red wines can go up to high 20s, early 30s. And then we basically check it every single day. We check the health of the yeast strains, we check the acidity, the sugars, how quickly it's fermenting, if it's clean. And yeah, you just look after it, just look after it. So this is a 2024 Bacchus that's grown in Herefordshire, just outside Ledbury. And this was picked early September. And the plan is to make this into a sparkling. But we make it in what's called the pet nat style, pétillant naturel style. So we bottle it before it's completely finished fermenting. So it's still fermenting very slowly. And then we'll bottle it before the end of the first fermentation so that it goes fizzy inside the bottle. And that's the way we make it. But if you haven't had Bacchus before, it's really aromatic, peachy, elderflowery. They call it the English Sauvignon Blanc, but it's really nothing like Sauvignon Blanc. This beast is a fermentation vessel that's made from concrete and fiberglass. We would have loved to use clay, but it's more fragile. And the other thing with clay is that you have to line the interior with beeswax in order for it to be hygienic and ferment well. And because all of our wines are vegan, we can't use beeswax. So it does the same job as clay. It breathes like a barrel. It doesn't impact flavor and doesn't become oaky, but it's just a really good way to make skin contact wines or orange wines.
What about temperature?
One of the downsides of this sort of style of winemaking is that we can't control the temperature once the fermentation has started. So normally you'd have jackets that would heat and cool the tanks, but with this, the best we can do if it's getting too hot is literally, and we've done it a few times, is put huge bags of ice inside the qvevri, it's called a qvevri, just so that we can reduce the temperature of the fermentation to make it slower, longer, and maintain the aromatics.
Yeah, qvevri is Georgian.
It's Georgian, yeah, these were originally made in Georgia. This was made actually in Canada by a Georgian maker, and we shipped it from Canada in 2017.
Did you know that oldest wine vessel, which was clay, belonged to 7,500 years ago, and it was in north of Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I mean, the Iranian and Persian winemaking history is incredible, and people just don't know about it. People just do not know. They don't even understand the history that Shiraz comes from, the origin of, of Iran. But let's see if we can educate the world. We use quite a bit of oak in the winery. We use a kind of variety. We use Hungarian oak, French oak, and American oak. And again, the beauty of making wine in London is that we don't have to play by any appellation rules. So if we buy grapefruit from Burgundy, we can use American oak if we want. If we buy great Chardonnay from Essex, we can use French oak or Hungarian oak. And we mainly use barrels so that the wines can soften and go through malolactic fermentation. We use a lot of used barrels, so we'll use them once and then reuse them. So reused barrels don't give the wine huge oakiness, but they just soften the wine. The oak essentially allows the wine to breathe. There is oxygen transfer through the grain of the wood, and they can soften a wine over time. And also, if you want to, specifically with English wines, if you have high malic acid in the grapes, it can malolactic fermentation, where the malic acid turns to lactic acid, gives it that creaminess and softens wines without mucking around with any chemicals.
Warwick, when you just say soften the wine, normally they are just saying that to soften the tannin. But when you're using English grape, do they have that much tannin in English grape?
If you're making reds, English grapes don't have that much tannic structure. Whites neither. I mean, when I talk about softening, it's really short to medium term micro oxidation. So oxygen is the friend of all wine. A small amount of oxygen during fermentation and aging can make wines brilliant, but too much turns into vinegar. And oak just has a really nice level of porosity that allows a nice level of oxygen to creep in. And that small micro-oxidation will soften the edges of wine over months.
And how long do you keep them?
So we keep the wines in barrel for up to 9 months because generally we want to use them, empty them, clean them, and use them again the next harvest. Sometimes for big reds, we'll leave them in for 2 or 3 years, which is the worst way to lose money in a small winery like this. You do not want to be aging wines for years because the rent in London's quite expensive. But you can reuse barrels for as long as they last. If you clean them well, sanitize them well, and look after them, they'll last forever.
What is the characteristic of Hungarian wine?
So, I mean, something people don't often realize is that European oak and North American oak are actually different varieties of oak tree. So you get dramatically different flavor profiles from aging wines in American oak versus European oak. But Hungarian, French, Polish, essentially it's the same genus of oak tree, but just grows in different climates. So the microclimate and the forest will determine the density of the oak, some of the flavor profiles, how tight the grain is, how moist the bark is. You know, basically, it's almost like a terroir of a grape, but on the wood side. And the differences between regional European styles of oak from the same family, they're small. You know, they are small. I mean, and one of the things that we want to do in the future is to show people wines that have been aged in French oak, Hungarian oak, Polish oak, but made exactly the same way, and compare the three together so you can tell yourself what the differences are. But we just want to be using innovative new styles of oak. Why does everyone have to buy oak from France? You know, the shame is that in the UK there's not really many barrels made from English oak, and there was only one cooper who would make wine barrels, and he closed during COVID. So from start to finish, from getting the grapes to making the wines, we can produce wines within about 4 months of the grape harvest, and we normally keep wines up to 6 or 7 months before bottling. And then once bottled, we bottle it all here. Once bottled, it's corked, labelled, boxed, and it's all sent off to our warehouse. We have a big warehouse that is, well, it's the biggest in the UK. It looks after everyone's wine, and that's where we send it out from. And yeah, that's kind of how it works.